Yeah, well, let's introduce myself. I'm Maggie Benya, founder and director of Strategic Security Initiative. And as you already know, today we are here to conduct a webinar on NATO after the summit, collective defense, deterrence, and resilience in a changing security environment. And I am pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers whose expertise spans from NATO policy, transatlantic security, regional defense, and hybrid threats. So thank you, all of you, for accepting our invitation and being today with us. I'll jump into their introductions, individual introductions, case-by case later on. But before that, I want to a little bit go through the context that we are in and what we will discuss throughout the webinar. So, as we all know, the 2026 NATO Summit in Ankara was another demonstration of NATO's ongoing adaptation process. It was mainly, I would say, about conventional military capabilities with the development of cooperation between private and public sectors, as well as improving, I would say, defense industrial cooperation and reinforcing the collective defense and deterrence. Also, it very well demonstrated that alliances investing in capabilities needed to deter and, if necessary, defend against high-paced, high-intensity conflict, I would say, while improving its readiness for an increasing contested security environment. But at the same time, there's also the question of hybrid threats and how NATO can address them, because we all know that in today's security environment, preparing only for, in the context of conventional military capabilities is not enough, because societies also struggle to defend themselves and to maintain resilience against the threats that stay below the threshold of armed conflict. And this is another question for the alliance. And all in all, basically, this is it. Military capabilities, defense industrial base, development of public-private cooperation, support for Ukraine, and hybrid threats. These were the topics that were discussed during the summit in NATO, and these are the topics that we'll explore and elaborate today. And having said that, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Giuseppe Spatafora. Dr. Spatafora is research analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies, where he leads the portfolio on transatlantic and EU-NATO relations. Previously, Giuseppe worked at NATO's policy planning unit in the Office of the Secretary General. He provided policy advice to Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on strategic issues such as support to Ukraine, strengthening transatlantic ties, strategic foresight, and emerging threats. His work has been instrumental in setting up several NATO policies. He served in the EU-NATO Task Force on Resilience of Critical Infrastructure, coordinated the Secretary General's annual report for 2022-2023, and supported NATO's reflection process on the Southern neighborhood. Thank you, Giuseppe, once again for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here today. So to start our discussion and to warm up a little bit the discussion, I would like to ask you what would be the most consequential outcome of NATO summit in Ankara, and how will it affect NATO, at least in the next decade? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and I want to thank everyone for inviting me, and congratulations on starting this new initiative. I understand it's a few months old, so again, good luck, but it's good to be here. Yeah, as you mentioned, I work at the EU. I used to work at NATO, but I look at transatlantic relations at the political level, so with an emphasis on security and defense. So that's where I will focus my remarks, but indeed we will talk specifically, since people here are interested in the summit outcomes. I will start from that and then discuss indeed what the impact is, the relevance, and whether some things have changed or not. So to start us off, and of course, this is my understanding of the summit and of the situation. This does not represent the position of the USS or any EU agency and so on. Look, we saw the NATO summit as an important public component, right? And we saw it with the arrival of all the leaders from across the alliance, more specifically with the arrival of President Trump. It started off with tensions. It started off with President Trump bringing a few grievances that reflect the state of transatlantic relations, more specifically the US being very unhappy about Europeans not supporting the effort in Iran, and bringing back some of the questions over Greenland, which was arguably the biggest transatlantic crisis that we've seen since the return of Trump, and probably unprecedented crisis in many ways. And compared to that, the way that it ended, it's better because it ended with less tensions. It ended with Trump being happy. It ended with many of the leaders being relatively satisfied with the way that the summit ended, and with a declaration that is very much, it did not reflect those tensions. It's a question of whether those were buried, just ignored, or whether they were actually solved. That remains a question mark. But indeed, if we look at the declaration that we were just discussing in the private section before we started the webinar, it's a short document. It's comparable to one from last year. Again, if you compare it to the summit declaration from 2024, 2023, those were 60, 70 paragraphs long. This one is 6 paragraphs. Last year was 5 paragraphs. So we're talking very, very short, sort of to the bare minimum. And that ignores, indeed, there's a lot of things that NATO used to cover publicly, such as China, such as the Middle East, and so on. And many of these topics are now not discussed in the declaration. But because the focus there is really to present something about NATO's core business, in a sense, that's how it's presented, and to focus the attention, among other things, that I think this is tailored to the US president in many ways. So if you look at the declaration, it has it has a commitment again to Article 5, a restatement of the transatlantic bond. So this is the key point of unity that NATO continues to repeat. Of course, each of us, it's up to us to believe that or not, whether the paper reflects the reality. That's a different story. Then there is a mentioning of the Russian threat and an emphasis on the fact that Europe and Canada are stepping up. There's a particular reference to spending. Of course, last year there was a 5% commitment in The Hague, and now the question is this year summit was about turning this into capabilities and actually doing the spending, let's say. So there's a mentioning of 139 billion, very specific number, of spending in defense by Europe and Canada. There was also on the side of the summit, there was this big defense industry forum where a lot of contracts were signed, were announced. I mean, this contract had been going on for months. Some had been agreed a time ago, but they were made public yesterday or 2 days ago in the context of the summit. There was 50 billion, more or less, of euros in contracts, indicating, so there was a lot of emphasis on bringing the industry, giving a signal that European countries are spending and they want to do contracts and therefore push the industry to ramp up production. There was also this reference to the so-called, these are one of the new phrases, the stronger Europe in a stronger NATO, which is an emphasis on the fact that Europeans are pushing for more leadership within the alliance, again, as requested by the US, but also as the strategic environment requires. But also by saying that this happens in the context of NATO. So specifically, pushing away against the idea of strategic autonomy, perhaps, and other things that, of course, are discussed in other contexts, but not within NATO. There was an emphasis also on Ukraine, and I know that Ambassador Hertz will talk about it, so I will not talk about it much, but there were a couple of wins from Ukraine, the 70 billion spending pledge by European countries. It's a question whether this is new money or not. This is part of it is not new money. And then there was, of course, the ability, the promise by the United States that they will set up Patriot factories in Ukraine. One interesting thing is that this time there was no much of a discussion of the Pearl initiative, of basically the mechanism through which European countries would buy weapons from the US for Ukraine. And this is, I think, is a reflection of the time where we are. The United States supplies have become less reliable, and their defense industry is very stretched. So Europeans are less, and that tool, which was to try to keep the US involved through that purchases, is less likely. If anything, we're seeing a move towards producing US weapons in Europe. That's been one of the outcome of the NATO industry forum. There was obviously also a reference to Iran in the second to last paragraph of the declaration, and that again indicates the context where we are, where the United States was, there was tension between the United States and Europe over Iran, and there continues to be some degree of tension, but they remained on sort of the baseline that Iran cannot have the nuclear weapons. So basically, an acknowledgement of the US scopes and of their language. Then the last thing about the declaration is that it ended saying that there will be a new summit in Albania, but they did not say when. And that is interesting because in the past few years, there's been a summit every year, and it was always said when they would meet again. Back during the Cold War, this wasn't the case, or even in the years up to 2019. It was before 2019, the Allies met every 2 years, and before then, even longer. They spent more time without meeting. It's really a matter of the last few years they met every year. And I think the reason that they decided to not to place a new date has to do with the fact that there's a political issue. The fact that, as usual, they would need, every time that there's a NATO summit, there's always the fear that Trump would come and sort of create some sort of transatlantic crisis, which hasn't happened in the past 2 summits. They've actually been able to deal with it. The problem was actually away from the summit when the president is in Washington and let's say that some of his advisors or his own thinking pushes more towards the Europeans, characterizing the European as free riders or not good allies. So, but anyway, in order to avoid that, that's probably one of the reasons why there's no date. There's also probably a more technical reason that it's difficult to come up with deliverables for every year. It's difficult to come up with something big to tell the public. A lot of work that NATO does is secret, or at least it's classified, so it cannot be divulged. And for that reason, that some of the transformation that NATO is undergoing will require years to come to fruition. So again, it would potentially be difficult to come up with some concrete deliverable for next year. So that might be another reason why it was postponed. Okay, this is the outcome of the summit. Now let me share whether my assessment of what happened, of what is the reality, let's say. I don't think the summit changed the fundamental trends of transatlantic relations and on European security. I think that the US commitment continues to remain unreliable due to the political tensions. As we've seen several times, the United States can use troop withdrawals or weapons withdrawals as a punishment for certain actions. And it happened in the context of the war in Iran. It happened in other situations. So, and that continues to be a sort of open-ended process. We don't have a full plan. We know the United States, as part of NATO 3.0, wants to reduce its presence within the alliance and give leadership to Europeans for collective defense and conventional deterrence specifically. But this has not happened in a way that was clear and coordinated, at least so far. The Europeans are also stepping up. That again has not changed. There's been a significant increase in spending and a significant show of capabilities, and therefore this shows a movement towards this new NATO where Europeans provide more capabilities, and again trying to keep it within a transatlantic framework. There was also, as I said, attempts to try to bury the political tensions below and maintain the level of cooperation at the technical defense level. Of course, it has left also some open questions, such as when somebody tells me what exactly NATO 3.0 looks like, that remains a bit of a difficult question to answer. We know it's one in which Europeans take the lead and the Americans are there for some key capabilities, but they are not in the lead. But again, this continues to be complicated by the fact that there's no full planning from Washington, that the Europeans are focusing on certain capability gaps, but they may not want to open some other areas of capability and such as some of the enablers, because they want the United States to keep providing them. But that, of course, relies on the assumption that the United States will provide them, which, again, in this context, and with potential new crises in the Middle East, in the Pacific, and elsewhere, might actually make it less likely. And so this opens the question that is the commentary that I wrote this morning, whether the Europeans should continue planning just within NATO which will leave some of these elements unquestioned, or whether they should start, in addition to working within NATO, doing some clear thinking on their own on how they should think about fighting without the United States, how they should set up their forces in a way that, and how they can coalesce them without the US as the backbone, which has always been the case. So these are things that remain open-ended in a sense, and sort of where you sit is sort of how you think, depending on whether you are closer to the front line. Some countries don't want to talk about it; they just want to maintain the U.S. commitment at any cost. And then when you're further away, perhaps some others are considering opening those questions. But it's also true that further away you are from the threat, that is also reduces the incentive to make some of the necessary changes that are required. Now, so these are some of the issues that remain open-ended, in my opinion. What will happen in the next few months? Let's say, I believe that the transition will continue to take place. It may not happen fast enough. It's a question of timeline, because we need to make sure that the transition to a European-led deterrence happens before the US withdraws the key capabilities. And in some cases, this is already happening. Think about the long-range strikes, which were supposed to come earlier this year, and they have not. Or before, and of course, for Europeans, it will take time to set them up. And before Russia believes that it can challenge, because I'm not an expert on Russia, but there is a lot of questions about whether Russia will be willing to just sit back, or will want to make some provocations and try to break up the alliance or test their political unity and their commitment. That is always a possibility. Of course, this also depends on how long the war in Ukraine goes and in which direction. But it is, of course, it's a threat that cannot remain, let's say, ignored. And therefore, this capability timeline is a problem. As I said, I think the Europeans may remain too concerned of opening certain questions, because there is something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, the fear that they could push the United States further away by opening by talking about fully replacing the Americans. This is not something that I fully agree with, but I know it's a concern, a political concern that exists. And then another thing in the future, when it comes to defense spending, is a question on the role of collective spending versus individual, or collective procurement, collective development versus individual work. As we've seen, there's a lot of growth in defense spending, but of course, basically the totality has to do with national countries, national member states, or allies spending on their own defense capabilities. If anything, this increase in spending has reduced the appetite to do collective action in terms of cooperative procurement, cooperative weapons development. Now, unilateral groupings are starting, they have existed for a long time, but they continue to exist, but they're objectively more complicated. And this is a question, somebody who works in the EU creates question for the EU instruments, which have been set up to improve Europeans, to support European taking responsibility for their own deterrence, but doing it in such a way that also generates a European defense market. And it remains a little bit unclear to what extent this will be the preferred choice of individual countries, as opposed to spending individually with their own national finances. And there are all sorts of limitations there. Now, it is one of my assessments is that it is fine to work individually to develop these capabilities, as long as they are developed. And it is better for some, but for others, it will be necessary to work together, because simply some of these capabilities, the high-end enablers, were provided by the United States because it was by far the strongest country, and there is no country that can sing on its own take over those positions. So it will need to be done collectively in some areas. Collectively, I don't mean at 27 or at 31, but it does mean that some of these actions will need to be done by countries together, as opposed to continue in fragmentation. And of course, in all these, the role of Ukraine and the experience of Ukraine will be fundamental. And I think on that note, I've reached my 15 minutes, so I'll stop now, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful overview of the summit outcomes, I would say. Thank you for that. It's a good start. So now I am going to our next speaker, Ambassador Herbst. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for being with us. It's a great honor of mine to host you here today. Ambassador Herbst doesn't need an introduction, but I'll still give you the one. I will give you the one. So please, Ambassador Herbst is Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He has served for 31 years as a Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Department of State, retiring with the rank of Career Minister. During this period, he held numerous high-ranking positions, including his service as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 and 2006, where he worked to strengthen U.S.-Ukrainian relations, support fair presidential elections, and help prevent violence during the Orange Revolution. His honors include the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of State's Career Achievement Award, and many others, of course. And as a recognized expert on Ukraine, Russia, and Central Asia, Ambassador Herbst has authored numerous articles, book chapters, and op-eds published in different outlets. Thank you again. Thank you for being with us. As Giuseppe also mentioned, as we all know, there were, I would say, still important developments for Ukraine, especially in the context of military support. This 70 billion euros maintaining, I'll still call it like maintaining support for Ukraine in 2026 and also continuing with the same pace in 2027. But at the same time, it was also significant in terms of U.S. engagement, especially in light of President Donald Trump's announcement to grant license to Ukraine to produce the Patriot system. So my question would be, in your opinion, how significant are these developments in practical terms, and would they tell us about NATO's long-term approach to supporting Ukraine? Yeah.
Okay. First, if you want to know what I think about what just happened, I have an op-ed that appeared in the New York Post today, so you can go there and find it. And I like to write in the New York Post because I know that the White House reads the New York Post.
Okay. We'll take that into account because I was looking for. Thank you.
I think that the anchor, of the Turkey Summit, NATO Summit, turned out very well. And just before I answer your question, to talk about the overall outcome, it was a surprise for many people. I don't always get things right, but it was not a surprise for me. The outcome this year on the question of the U.S. role in NATO was very much like the outcome a year ago, meaning that the summit was preceded by many Trump criticisms of the alliance, and not just the preceded, but the first day Trump arrived, we heard a lot of criticism of NATO. It had the new element, new to this summit, relating to the response of NATO members to Trump's adventure in the Persian Gulf. But you had that as the entree, but then the actual result was rather positive. A short communique is a good thing at this point in time, given the circumstances. And Russian hopes to see the alliance frayed as a result of the summit in Ankara were not met. I would say you could call it a modest improvement of the American commitment to NATO in the Trump administration. And again, that's very much what happened last year. And it's also rather similar to Trump's participation in Davos, because both in Davos as before this summit, Greenland figured as a spoiler, and then it was basically just dropped. So we know that President Trump has a fixation on Greenland, and we'll have to manage this in the years ahead. But no damage was done to the alliance on this issue, or I think any issue, which is very, very important. So that's one of two reasons why I think that Vladimir Vladimirovich is not very happy with the Ankara summit. And I focused in the piece that I did for the New York Post on his unhappiness related to the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. We had some indication before President Trump arrived in Ankara that there could be some movement on licensing for the building of Patriot interceptors in Ukraine or elsewhere in Europe. But the whole way this issue occurred or was developed at the summit was a great positive. Now, the big thing, of course, is Trump saying, yes, we're going to give this approval so that this product can be produced outside of the United States. And given the very sharp deficit in Patriots and Patriot interceptors, not just for Ukraine, but for all American allies and partners, this is a very positive development. But also, President Trump mentioned again, and this is very important, the deal on U.S.-Ukraine joint production of drones, which had been an important part of the Trump-Zelensky meeting in New York City in September of last year. But I can tell you that that issue barely moved since then, and it was being held up because there are pockets of the administration which I would say are clueless about American interests in Europe, not just in Ukraine, and saw no reason to move this forward. I believe, as a result of the meeting in Ankara between the two presidents, that roadblocks that they were responsible for have been removed or in the process of removal. So these are all very good things for American interests and for NATO and for Ukraine. For American interest, for reasons I believe everyone on this call understands, Moscow considers the United States to be its principal adversary. Moscow wants to greatly weaken the United States. Moscow understands that if its victory in its aggression in Ukraine would be a substantial blow to the United States and NATO. And therefore, it's critical for American interests that Putin lose in Ukraine. Sadly, we have not had a president since Moscow began this war in 2014 who understands what I just said as clearly as I stated it. But Trump has said since before he came back into the White House, and I believe this is true, although some of my colleagues do not, Trump has said he wants to achieve a stable end to Moscow's aggression in Ukraine. And the only way to achieve that, of course, is to put maximum pressure on the Kremlin. And what he did in Ankara was a clear step in that direction. And the way this all played out in Ankara underscores that. And I'll explain what I mean. If you'll recall, on July 4, right, our Independence Day, Putin called Trump to congratulate him, right, on American independence. But he didn't need an hour and a half, which is how long the call reportedly lasted, to say congratulations on July 4. He called Trump on July 4 for the same reason he called Trump 2 or 3 days before Zelensky showed up in the White House in late October. In October, Putin was driven by the public statement and the private statement that Trump had made to Zelensky in New York when they met in September, that he was considering giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, something which I long have advocated. So the purpose of the Putin call was to put a kibosh on that. And he succeeded. He succeeded. Putin hoped to do something similar with this call. The the question of licensing Ukraine to build Patriot interceptors was not really out in public domain. But certainly the prospective drone deal was out in the public domain. And of course, the possibility of Trump complicating the US-NATO relationship was out there before the summit. And so Putin made that call to see if he could maximize harm to NATO, harm to Ukraine from Trump's participation at the NATO summit. And clearly that failed. Clearly that failed. And a very important reason for that failure has been the extraordinary Ukrainian achievements in defense technology and the impact that has had on the war. It still amazes me that some of the experts in the West on the military aspect of this war still think Moscow has an advantage. I'm amongst those who think that no, it's clear that today Ukraine has an advantage, which is not the same as saying that therefore the tide of the war has turned. Although I think it's possible we are witnessing the tide of the war turning. More important than my observations, of course, is the impact of these developments on the Trump administration. It's worth recalling that the worst of the 28 points in the quote unquote American peace proposal that was put forward to Ukraine in November was the notion that Ukraine should hand over to Moscow Western Donbass, which the Russians have been unable to conquer, despite saying they were going to roll through the Donbass once their offensive to take Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv had failed in the spring of 22. And as recently as early March, Vice President Vance said, of course Ukraine should give this over, because the Russians will take it if they don't. Well, here we are 4 months later, and the Russians haven't even clearly taken Konstantinivka, although they're claiming they've taken it. You can be sure that President Trump is aware of the remarkable things that have been happening in the war, basically starting in mid-April. And I'm talking about the massive problems in Crimea as a result of Ukraine's air dominance and sea dominance too, which are all drone related. He's aware of the difficulty of Russia supplying all of its frontline troops as a result of the dominance of Ukraine drones in that mid-space, right? But now the mid-space is defined as out to 200 kilometers. And of course, he's aware, because the most spectacular footage we see on X or on television of the Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia. So we were all amused by the strikes that took place during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. We were equally amused, but understanding the strategic significance of Ukrainian strikes on communication facilities, which are used by the Russian military, and not just the Russian military, outside of Moscow. We were amazed by the strike into Omsk, right? Over 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And we're all gobsmacked, but more importantly, the Russian public is gobsmacked by the lines of cars trying to get petrol in something like 43 regions of Russia. And I think that has something to do with statements coming from Trump about what magnificent and ingenious warriors Ukrainians are. And since Trump likes a winner, this is having an impact. This is having an impact. And that's really important to understand the two things that we're all talking about from the bilateral meeting at the NATO summit, meaning the licensing on the Patriot interceptors and the renewed emphasis on the drone deal. And I can tell you, because we follow this closely, there are some signs that those roadblocks I referred to are being taken down. Now, none of this is for sure. What we're describing is where U.S. policy is at this moment. President Trump is mercurial, but again, I've been saying since the fall of 24 that if Trump wins, he does have this E-Day fix, and this is a good E-Day fix on establishing a stable peace to the Russian war in Ukraine. And he's never abandoned that, even though I think a majority of my colleagues in the think tank world would disagree with what I've said, what I'm saying right now. So if what we are watching at the moment is still U.S. policy 3 months from now, you will see major steps forward on both of these issues. Now, that does not mean that things happen immediately. I mean, an immediate impact. There are difficult intellectual property rights issues relating to this licensing decision. There are many American defense firms who play a role in the production of Patriots and the interceptor missiles. So that has to be figured out and taken care of. There are also the difficult supply chain issues of setting up new factories. But if this is truly a priority for the President of the United States, let's say the American bureaucracy, which has not always played smartly on this issue, even when Trump was heading in the right direction, will be kicked into gear, and we'll see this planning work. We'll see these ideas becoming actual policy with real world impact. Last point. I complained already about some of my military expert colleagues and their presentation of the war. One serious failure in that presentation has been basically ignoring the debate within the Russian community. I mean, the Russian, amongst Russian war bloggers about the war, where I say there is a clear-eyed understanding of the difficulty of Russia's position today. And that understanding has a little bit appeared, even on the main Russian TV propaganda program, Solovyov's program, 60 Minutes, Большая игра. We're seeing this reflected there. And, you can't say when an authoritarian regime is going to have a significant change, but all of these markers, the major statements we're seeing on Russian social media, people complaining about Russian leadership, whether it's about the economy, about petroleum shortages, the blockage of the internet. These are not signs of a stable dictatorship. How that plays out, I mean, I can describe in hypothetical fashion how this plays out, but I can't say for sure it's going to lead to a change in policy or a change in regime by a date certain. But I've said literally since the war began in 2014, and then since the big invasion of 22, that if major Western support for Ukraine continues, there's no way Ukraine could lose this war, but the war is going to last a long time. In the wake of what we're seeing today, my new view is that this war could end in 2 years, unless, I mean, again, if you'll still need that major Western support, especially on the economic side. But the only way that does not play out is if Russia manages a great technological leap forward in not just drone issues, but the overall issues of the weapons of war that work at this point in time. And it's possible that could happen. Clearly, this is a high priority for the Kremlin. Clearly, Belousov and Rubicon are serious players. But let me offer an analysis which has basically been ignored at the price of smart thinking and foresight. People love to talk about the clear Russian advantages in terms of the size of their economy, their ability to scale up industrial defense production, all true, and size of their population. But there's one serious structural advantage you might say Ukraine, well, there are two serious structural advantages Ukraine has. The first, of course, is their population is all in for this war because they realize it's existential for them to live as Ukrainians. Whereas there's no existential issue in this for Russia, for anyone except for possibly Putin. But the other advantage, and this really speaks to structure as opposed to social psychology. Ukraine is a democratic society. It has never been a country that was run, from the vertical of power. Kuchma told Putin famously when Putin summoned him to Moscow in the midst of the Orange Revolution that, we're not like you, we're not like Russia. I can't crack down on the people of Ukraine as they demonstrate. And that fact, in a sense, explains the breakthrough Ukraine has created in the tech space, because it's not a bureaucracy with vast resources that you have in Russia overseeing these technological breakthroughs. It's the smart Ukrainians sitting in their kitchens developing these things. And then the integration of this talent into the Russian military. So you have you have Ukrainian soldier engineers who are out there managing these drones, but you also have just engineers sitting next to them at the front, or in networks that have been remarkably put together, offering ideas as they watch their weapons perform. So they're innovating every day. That suggests to me it will be very hard for Russia to overtake Ukraine's tech advantage, but it could happen. And so that's something to watch. And there are specific things which we've seen, I've seen in the last few weeks, which could be an indication of Russia catching up or in a serious fashion. One is, by and large, the Ukrainians have neutered Russia's drone offensive capability. But there have been reports, and I think these reports are true. You always have to check out what you see on X first. That the Russians have managed to put far stronger engines on their drones, and the Ukrainians have had some trouble with those. There's also the report from like 4 days ago, which I have not had time to check out, that the Russians in one day destroyed 4 Ukrainian flamingos. If that's true, that's a big deal. And maybe that could mean that these long-range strikes we've witnessed, like on Omsk or Ufa, are a temporary phenomenon. But again, I haven't confirmed that. I think in 2 different postings on X. It hasn't been confirmed, and we know we've seen strikes since then, which have been truly damaging at distance. So I don't know if that's true, but I'm saying those are the sorts of things you look for to figure out if the current advantage Ukraine enjoys is temporary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was really impressive in such a short period of time to highlight everything that is going on around the Ukraine. And one thing just came to my mind that like 2 days ago or something, I was discussing with my uncle. We usually talk about the thing, and he remembered the last years of Soviet Union when similar alliance up for oil, for fuel and oil were there, and after that the Soviet Union collapsed. So hopefully, yeah.
Let me mention one more thing for entertainment value. And
Okay.
this is that piece I put in the post this morning. I assume everyone knows who Gir Konstrelkov is. The guy who was very much involved in Transnistria a while back, and then of course in Crimea in 2014, and then of course in occupied eastern Ukraine in 2014. A premier war blogger who's been criticizing Russia for the Kremlin for weak policies, and has been sitting in a jail for that reason for almost 3 years now. Maybe it is 3 years now. but somehow he still has access to the internet. And
Yeah.
he put out within 2 or 3 hours of the Zelensky-Trump meeting in Ankara that Trump is leading Putin around by the nose,
Okay.
which is the exact opposite of the common wisdom that Putin is tapping Trump along. Now, I think it's possible that both things can be true, but
Mhm.
in my article, because, well, never mind, I just talk about the negative interpretation, negative for the Kremlin. Anyway.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And that's precisely why the Ukrainians need more Western support in order to,
Absolutely.
win this war. So thank you very much. And now I will move to our next speaker, Neil, Dr. Neil Malwin. Thank you for being with us. It's a great pleasure again. It's been quite some time since our last meeting in person. Neil is head of Arctic and High North program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Before joining UE, he was the director of international security at the Royal United Service Institute Rosse in London, and he has been head of research at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Neil has held senior advisor positions in the European Union Energy Charter and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he has been a consultant for the United Nations on security and conflict issues. Neil has held teaching positions at the Brussels School of International Studies, the University of Leeds, and the London School of Economics. So welcome to our webinar, Neil, once again. I would like to highlight one, to put our attention to one very interesting aspect of NATO. It's a very new front line for the alliance, but okay, I understand that the focus of NATO summits in Ankara was not, specific regions. We did not see discussions or specific decisions on Black Sea, on Northern Europe, or any other region which is significant for the alliance, inside the alliance, or in its immediate neighborhood. But considering the decisions that were made during the summit about military industrial development, resilience, and also defense planning, and considering at the same time the experience of the countries that recently joined the alliance, like specifically Sweden and Finland, and their experience with integrated defense planning and other matters related to this, how their lessons and their experience can be used in implementing the decisions made in Ankara. So, Neil, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks so much to both Maggie and Irina for the invitation. It's great to be on this this webinar, and congratulations on launching your new initiative.
Thank you.
I mean, you said it that sort of there wasn't a regional focus, but I would actually say that in some ways in Ankara, NATO's growing strategic focus on Northern Europe and the High North was really a cornerstone, actually, of the summit. And the second day, the Arctic was identified on the agenda as a major theme for activities. But as you said, I mean, there was a lot of things running through the whole program that really covered this area. And the messaging ahead of and around the summit in Ankara, I think, was really designed to set out how the alliance and its individual members are stepping up to take more responsibility for their own defense in the Arctic and High North. And this has been most evident, I think, as Giuseppe was talking about, in terms of progress towards reaching defense spending commitments. So those kind of bottom lines was very much a theme running through the Arctic discussion, sort of reflecting what had been committed to last year in The Hague. But then also progress towards a set of announcements about new capabilities, both in the Defence Forum at sort of ahead of the summit, and I can go into more detail on that, as well as delivering on and strengthening security arrangements and initiatives focused on the Arctic and High North. So the approach, I think, that had been cooked up a bit ahead of the summit was this idea of focusing on tangible actions to leverage the bigger budgets, while signaling that the next steps were to build on NATO's Arctic Sentry mission as a platform coordination for Northern European and particularly Arctic security, and then to demonstrate this sort of the implementation of these commitments not to announce new initiatives or commitments really, and not to get into big debates. So that of course was the plan, but the plan didn't really survive contact, as they say in the military world, because as soon as Donald Trump touched down, then of course he immediately opened the whole Greenland issue, which was the idea, I think, was to not to bring that up and to manage it. And so on arrival in Ankara, Trump stated that Greenland, quote, should be controlled by the United States, not by Denmark. So setting off a bit of an incendiary beginning. And then, of course, we immediately began what looked like a horrible repeat of the early part of the year, the spiral in which the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, went out and said she was ready to defend every inch of NATO, including our own territory. As soon as she arrived in Ankara, Mark Rutte weighed in, trying to sort of, I think, take up his role that he's done, where he said that Trump actually had a point, that China and Russia are seeking increasing sway in the Arctic, and this was why NATO was stepping up in the region. So we really looked like there was in danger that the summit would disappear down the Greenland rabbit hole at that point. But then I think, I mean, as Giuseppe mentioned, there seems to be a bit of a reversion to this idea of keep calm and carry on somehow. And reports are that Trump didn't then subsequently raise the Greenland issue during the heads of government meeting. So this seems to be very much about external messaging, a reminder to NATO members about the ongoing concerns that Trump and the administration has about the Arctic, in particular about Greenland. But then he suddenly switched into his, I mean, in his very kind of Trumpian language about how much love there was. There was a bit of love bombing going on and the message of unity. And then we sort of saw, I think, a reversion to what was Plan A for NATO, which was this messaging about how the alliance is stepping up on the Arctic and highlighting what is already underway. And so I think we saw here 4 really interlinked initiatives getting a lot of prominence that have been put in place in this year ahead of the summit. And the first one being NATO's new Northern Land Component. So on June the 6th of June this year, NATO formally activated its forward land forces Finland during a ceremony actually here where I am in Sweden, in northern Sweden, in Boden, which is the head of it's going to be the headquarters for the new Swedish brigade up in the north. And the FLN Finland is really this new multinational presence in northern Finland, which is going to designed to offer enhanced deterrence and operational exposure in an Arctic context. It goes back to the Washington Summit in 2024, when just after Sweden had joined, Sweden was confirmed as a framework nation, although it's about the defense of Lapland. But now we're really seeing this coming to fruition. And I mean, the deliverable beyond this at the summit was that France committed actually that it was going to have a rotational presence in that FLN Finland. It's going to have at least a company on the rotation based in northern Sweden. So it's not just going to be a Nordic initiative, but there's a wider engagement on Arctic security there. So that was one sort of deliverable already ahead of the summit that I think Rutte and others were pointing to. The second one was the Arctic Century, launched in February this year, designed in many ways to try and head off the Trump criticism about NATO not doing enough in Arctic. And since then, of course, what we've seen is quite a lot of activity around and badged as Arctic Century, and also some internal reorganization in NATO with Joint Force Command Norfolk taking overall responsibility for this wider region, including the Arctic, and sort of consolidation of the NATO structures around Arctic security, and lots of messaging around NATO's enhanced posture in the Arctic and High North, building on really also the long-standing NATO air policing mission in Iceland. So thirdly, we've got an initiative underway in NATO to improve regional awareness. Task Force X Arctic was launched to strengthen awareness in the Arctic and High North. So this is led by Allied Command Transformation, is really sort of about new technologies, about autonomous systems, about improving domain awareness in the Arctic, and is really designed to underpin and feed in to reinforce Arctic Century. Late last year, we had the new NATO Combined Air Operations Center opening in Buda, the KAOK, so a much stronger air component coming into the high north. And underpinning all of these sort of concrete initiatives, we've seen a higher tempo of exercising across the region. So we had the Cold Response 26 in March, more than 32,000 troops from allied nations operating in Norway, Finland. We've seen the UK, when the UK currently has major operative exercises underway, both national ones, Lion Protector, where it's deployed its carrier strike group, but then these are also being badged under Arctic Sentry, and the carrier strike group has been placed under NATO command. We had exercise Dynamic Mongoose, which is sort of the premier anti-submarine warfare taking place and led by Norway. We've had Ramstein Flag, which is the air component, which was operating through this KAOK in Buda with a sort of air operations right across Northern Europe, but down as far as Spain. So all of that happened sort of leading into the summit, and that was the background that I think NATO and Rutte, in particular when he went to Washington, was pointing to. When it came to the summit itself, what we saw, I think, was then this concerted effort to try and message this directly. So we had Norwegian Minister of Defense going right out at the beginning of the summit with this idea that we're already doing the hard work in the Arctic. So he gave an interview to, among others, Politico, stating that and sort of arguing that Norway sees the Arctic problem perhaps differently than the Trump administration. It's not primarily about Greenland. They don't see the same level of threat to Russia and China around Greenland. It's really about this concern about the European Arctic. And there, what NATO is doing is actually defending the United States, but far from the US shore. So this is actually homeland defense taking place by European allies in European waters. And at the summit, the NATO summit in Ankara, Norway announced this a new maritime initiative focused on the north, 11 European countries and Canada cooperating on security in the north, designed to really to improve command and control, emphasize freedom of navigation, secure lines of communication. Again, this is building on other things that have been happening. The UK has been running a Northern Navies initiative, bringing together Northern Navies around the JEF, Joint Expeditionary Framework, and the UK and a sort of commitment to the Atlantic Bastion to repopulate the Greenland, Iceland, Faroes gap with a defensive line. All of that was then reinforced by a set of messaging about capabilities. So ahead of the summit, Canada announced the new submarine deal, buying 12 German Norwegian submarines. And really, I think perhaps the Germans clinching this deal over the South Koreans, while there may have been some technical advantages, it was really a Canadian reinvestment in the alliance and in the Northern European dimensions of that. In June, Sweden and Poland concluded their strategic partnership, delivering Swedish submarines for the Baltic region. Denmark came out right at the beginning of the summit with the announcement of 2 new Poseidon P-8s maritime patrol aircraft for anti-submarine warfare in the Arctic and North. NATO, of course, committed to buying these 10 GlobalEye early warning and ISR planes from Sweden. We saw Denmark, Finland, Germany, and Norway committing to buy 5 Northrop Grumman surveillance drones, which is going to be primarily used in the north. There's Sweden and Finland did deals about a new coalition around tracked vehicles for Arctic warfare. The UK and Netherlands announced 8 new ships for maritime amphibious warfare. Again, this is going to be focused primarily in the north. We saw the coalition on deep strike, which wasn't just about the north, but is heavily weighted towards the north. It's mostly Northern European countries. That's a 50 billion euro project with sort of, I would say, 75 to 80% of the countries are from the Northern Europe. And then we saw, of course, after the summit, Germany committing to buy Tomahawks. And so while Germany's not necessarily an Arctic country, I think it is part of this constellation of countries that we see coming together, particularly around Baltic, Arctic and high north security. We also saw, I think, a confirmation that there's a shifting military posture in Northern Europe. So in May, again, ahead of the summit, there was an announcement that the German-Dutch Corps would be taking command of NATO land forces, Estonia and Latvia. So the Baltic region now is going to have 2 core headquarters, a Polish-based one doing Lithuania and Poland, and now the Dutch-German one covering Estonia and Latvia. I think this is a signaling about NATO moving much more into fast response warfighting mode. I mean, we're not really now in the tripwire deterrence, absorbing an attack and then sort of responding over a long period of time. This is about warfighting quickly to stop Russia being able to move and do sort of land grabs, essentially. And at the summit, we saw the Baltic air policing mission that started in 2004 is now being expanded into an air defense mission. So that also now is essentially a war fighting. It's not just about policing Baltic airspace, it's about how to conduct air operations over the Baltic region. So what then kind of are my takeaways from this as about what this all means? So I've got 7 here. So first of all, I would say the Arctic High North and Baltic region, it offers a prime example of where European allies are in fact stepping up and laying the groundwork for deeper cooperation in the future. And this is, you can see, because this actually is where most defense spending is happening. We often talk about the Europeans responding, but the reality is that this is really led by the Northern Europeans. We see Germany and Poland as the largest in scale. I mean, Germany dwarfing almost anyone else on the European continent, particularly in the years ahead. But Poland making really substantial investments. The Nordic and Baltics making high percentage investments, although of course they're relatively smaller countries. But also the UK and the Dutch, who also bring scale, even though they don't have the same high levels of spending as the Nordic Baltic countries at the moment. So that, I mean, is point one, is this is where the big money in European defense is really going at the moment. Secondly, the alliance is building a military architecture in the Arctic and High North through these initiatives linked to the regional plan Northwest and with the Joint Force Command Norfolk as the anchor. So this is plan A, is to build out these new capabilities in that realigned NATO framework and with those broad NATO missions. But thirdly, I think underneath this, what this signals actually is this Northern European eastern flank as the center of gravity for NATO security increasingly. This is the sub-region that is also leading support for Ukraine. If you look at where is the big money coming from for Ukraine, it's from those countries I mentioned earlier. I mean, if you actually, when I was working before I joined my current employer, I was working at RUSI in London. You can cut this spending many ways, but actually we did a calculation about the GEF countries, and it's the GEF countries that are probably spending. GEF plus Germany is definitely spending the most on Ukraine. And this, of course, is then having an impact in terms of developing the wider alliance politics. And I would say it's actually shaping the new security order of Europe that is emerging as the role of the US in the continent shift. And this takes me to sort of observation 4 about this new order. What we see is a growing integration of a European security and defense community across the Arctic and High North, the North Atlantic and the Baltic space, alongside a continuing US engagement and interest in this area. So it's not, unlike perhaps other parts of Europe, that there isn't really a sense that the US is pulling back from this space. It continues to be a core US interest, and it's most likely that this, even if the US isn't as fully integrated into NATO and European structures, the US will continue to operate in the Arctic and High North because this is about defending the homeland. And so we're not going to see a change there. I mean, it's not leaving this part of Europe. So NATO remains the central framework, but we're seeing an increasing density of security and defense relationships through bilateral, minilateral, and even larger scale frameworks such as the GEF, Nordic Baltic 8, NORDEFCO, Defence Industry Cooperation. The most dense defence industry cooperation, I think, is really across this northern region if you look at the partnerships. And Canada is attempting to reposition itself as having a much stronger Northern European and Arctic engagement in this space as part of its hedge against the US. Fifth is that what we see, I think, comes out of the summit, but more broadly, is that NATO's Arctic is changing with the inclusion of Sweden and Finland. The strategic challenge of all of this now is how to integrate Baltic, Northern Finland, Sweden and Norway through land forces with the Barents Sea, the traditional maritime focus of NATO, and the Greenland, Iceland, UK and Bear Gaps. This change is affecting the balance across the north because NATO's position in the north for decades has been shaped by Norway and its maritime security interests. And we're now seeing this initiative try and incorporate Sweden and Finland and a strong land dimension for the first time. So the summit, this is six, the summit signaled that NATO now has moved beyond this tripwire responses to considering warfighting in the region and how to do large-scale maneuver warfighting as the basis for deterrence. And that is underpinned by the commitment now of not 1 inch of territory. So you have to be ready to do warfighting the moment that Russia dips its toe across the NATO border. So this is a very different defense posture, deterrence posture, and certainly very far from tripwire forces. And my last point is that Europeans, that they've clearly woken up to the need to make much bigger commitments to the Arctic and high north, and there's serious progress in this direction, especially regarding the European Arctic. At the moment, they're managing the issue with tensions with the US within the alliance framework. There's a 2-track process with it, so NATO stepping up, but then the trilateral US, Greenland, Denmark conversation. But this is not going to go away. These tensions are more than just about Trump. They're also about a shifting Arctic security, and NATO is going to have to continue to evolve, and there's going to have to be bigger European commitments to this space if these tensions aren't going to become a more difficult issue for the alliance in the future.
Great, thank you very much. I think indeed Northern Europe, especially in light of the previous developments, even though we somehow forgot about them, that happened, and not only, especially considering Chinese and Russian activities in Arctic. So it's really interesting and noteworthy for the alliance as well. So now we are moving to our next speaker, last but not least, my colleague, Irina Mamulashvili. Thank you. I would like to also use this opportunity and thank you, Irina, for being very valuable part of this webinar and helping us organize it, not only being a speaker, but also being involved in operational part. Irina Mamulashvili is head of the International Security Program at Strategic Security Initiative. Her work focuses on international security dynamics with an emphasis on conflict intelligence, foreign interference, and involving states and hybrid threats. She previously worked at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, where she managed projects on Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, sanctions, sabotage, elections, EU security, and disinformation. Before that, Irina was a program manager and a researcher at the International Society for Fair Elections and Democracy, ISPED. She has also worked at the European Parliament supporting an MEP on issues related to the war in Ukraine, EU assistance and candidate status processes for Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. At the UK House of Commons, she conducted research on mechanisms for confiscating Russian assets to support Ukraine's reconstruction. Irina advises a range of stakeholders and contributes to international conferences as well as international media commentary. So my question, and kind of a very kind of last as a dessert question for our discussion, will be about hybrid threats. I would say, even though the summit declaration mentioned resilience, the importance of resilience, I think it was the last paragraph right before the sentence about Iran and the future of its nuclear program. We we observed that much of the summit was about conventional military capabilities. So I would like to ask you to elaborate the current state of hybrid pressure in Europe in general, especially for NATO's European allies, and also what practical steps should NATO take in order to deal with these challenges. And also before that, I would like to remind our audience you can use Q&A section of this webinar in order to leave your questions, and we will read them after Irina's remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you very much for our speakers. It's been real pleasure to listen to your thoughts and be part of this distinguished webinar. Yeah, Maggie, as you mentioned, hybrid threats are kind of thing that NATO basically focused over the last decade, I would say. So it's a bit new dimension for NATO. But we see that the scale, sophistication, and frequency of hybrid activity in NATO member states have increased significantly in recent years, and this includes cyber operations, sabotage activities, disinformation, political interference. And if we look at statistics, for example, which we can say that after following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, these hybrid threats have increased in NATO member states' territories. We can see that in 2022, for example, 2 serious sabotage incidents happened, followed by 12 sabotage incidents in 2023 and 34 in 2024. So this represents approximately 17-fold increase between 2022 and 2024. What's the main goal of this kind of sabotage operations or hybrid threats? So the main thing is that it exploits vulnerabilities within societies, undermine public trust, complicates decision making, and weaken political coercion. And of course, NATO understands these threats, and we saw that at the summit, as you rightly mentioned in the declaration, there is point 5, which refers. Which indicates that the alliance continues to respond and adapt to the strategic competition, pervasive in instability, hybrid threats, and recurrent shocks that define our broader security environment. That's a quote from the declaration, and we saw that this category falls under broader security challenges. Section. I'm just gonna zoom out to just briefly say how NATO views these hybrid threats and what kind of strategy it had. So over the last decade, hybrid threat, we can very clearly see that NATO understands that it's not a peripheral security issue anymore, and this became kind of core element of collective defense. And in response, first it was in 2015 when after the summit, when its first strategy on countering hybrid warfare was introduced, and this included 3 pillars. One was to prepare, deter, and to defend. So on prepare side, what they mean is to understand the threat before it materializes, which means that they try to reduce strategic surprise and to monitor hybrid threats. When it comes to deterrence, it's to increase the cost of hybrid aggression, which means that on this, NATO focused on 3 things. The first is to improve speed of political decision making. Second is to increase resilience by protecting critical infrastructure, strengthening cyber defenses, and improving societal preparedness in general. And third, which is very, very interesting point, I would say, is that they are trying to increase strategic ambiguity. And when I say that, I mean that since the Warsaw Summit in 2016, NATO has stated that hybrid attacks could, in certain circumstances, lead to invocation of Article 5, which is very interesting. And also, here is the main point here, that the fact that there is this strategic ambiguity around this is because there is no precise threshold about this invocation of Article 5. And the ambiguity is obviously complicates an adversary's calculations because they are not certain about the alliance's response. And third, it's defend, which means that they are supporting allies, but it's also important for us to understand that the primary responsibility for responding to hybrid threats rests within the affected ally, and it's not NATO's role to their role is to reinforce national capabilities rather than replace them. I just want to very quickly walk you through a few cases that happened on NATO territories, which some of them fall under sabotage incidents, some of them cyber incidents, and information operations. For example, in October 2023, there was Baltic Connector gas pipeline that was damaged between Finland and Estonia, together with telecommunications cables. And at the time, it was very hard to attribute who did that. But the campaign intensified in 2024 when the S-Link 2 electricity cable and several other telecommunication cables were damaged. And Finnish authorities then saw this kind of caught Eagle S a tanker, which believed to be part of Russia's foreign shadow fleet, and this shadow fleet vessel had caused the damage. What was response from NATO about this was that in January 2025, the alliance launched Baltic Sentry, which increased naval patrol, surveillance, and intelligence sharing, which basically improves protection of undersea infrastructure. Another interesting case was just before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when Russian military intelligence conducted a cyber attack against the Viasat satellite network, and so the immediate objective here was to disrupt Ukraine military command and communications, but the attack quickly went beyond and affected members of NATO and some European allies, and including approximately 6,000 German wind turbines that relied on the satellite network for remote management. We also saw a few attacks in 2024, in arson attack, for example, on Warsaw's Marioławska shopping center, which were Polish authorities attributed to Russian intelligence. We also saw attacks in London, for example, warehouse arson in 2025. This was a center dedicated for humanitarian aid and equipment for Ukraine. Also, this is very interesting how Russia's sabotage doctrine has changed. If we compare this tactics to Cold War dynamics, for example, we say that Russia at the time then basically conducted directly through intelligence officers this kind of attacks, high-profile attacks. But now they are locally recruiting criminals and intermediaries. And we conducted, when I was at RUSI, we conducted this workshop on financing of Russia sabotage in November last year. And it was very interesting for me to see that how this threat evolved, because as Daniela Richterova, King's College professor, frames it, she calls it gig economy model, which is very interesting model, which means that first the recruitment and coordination happens through digital platforms, meaning that Telegram, Instagram, online gaming platforms are very increasingly used to recruit these people. And secondly, this model relies on disposable, just one day kind of activity, and these are predominantly dominated by financial incentives. So this is not ideology kind of thing, but rather it's finance and money that motivate these people. And some of them don't even really know what they are, what's behind this. They just receive message. It could be just a request to take a photograph of a building kind of thing, and some of them not even sure what is it about. So financing has become an operational center of gravity, and I would say that now what NATO and its allies need to question is not only to ask who carried out the attack, but who recruited them, how were they paid, and which digital platforms facilitated this coordination. Obviously, there are a lot of other hybrid activities happening, which also include shadow fleet kind of intelligence, spy tankers, so-called. We also saw cyber information operations across different countries, obviously. Well, with the neighboring countries and election interference tactics have increased a lot. But what I would say is it's not only about propaganda content that Russia is conducting, but also it uses leaks, forged documents, fake personas, bots, deepfakes, and other AI generated content. And it's not only about to make Russia's side of the story right here in front of, for the people and for the government, but it's also important for them to make this confusion and to make governments look incompetent, make Ukraine support feel costly, and to make minorities or refugees into political pressure points. So just I would say there are a few questions that NATO hasn't answered, and I guess this would be what I would focus on moving forward. Well, when it comes to how NATO should frame its strategy. First thing is that how fast do NATO members, governments agree what happens? Because that's the thing that actually there is a drone over a military site, let's say, and then there is fire at a logistics warehouse. They are starting questioning, is it an incident, criminal act, intelligence operation, terrorist incident? And Russia benefits when that classification process is slow because public anxiety rises and attackers learn how long the political system needs before it can act. And, same applies to attribution. This is quite slow, and I understand I'm not saying that they should lower the standards or make accusations without evidence, but this court level proof really kind of makes this process really slow, which again Russia benefits from. And it means like they need to build response options that match level of confidence. And I would say that information sharing is very fragmented. One country sees a suspicious vessel, another sees drone activity, police investigates arson, for example. And if those pieces remain separated, Europe sees incidents and Russia sees the campaign. So that's where Russia wins, I would say. And what's very interesting, just yesterday we were talking about human intelligence with David Joe from King's College, and he mentioned how important it is to rely on private sector and kind of open source investigations that consulting firms are conducting. And I agree with that on this domain as well, because I guess all these ports, railways, telecommunications are owned by private sectors, and NATO needs to kind of increase its public-private collaboration when it comes to this. So mindful of time and mindful this is Friday, and obviously people want to enjoy pre-weekend activities. Just gonna wrap up by saying that of course NATO understands the threat, and there is no question around this because they have been mentioning this throughout different events and statements and documents and strategies. But the idea is not that they need stronger language, but the question is whether they are prepared to close the gaps that make this threat effective. So they need faster attribution process, legal clarity for operation, and resilient infrastructure, and keeping up with this evolving threats, which also includes finances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inga. It was a wonderful evaluation of the threats from another angle that NATO is facing. And since we are running slightly out of time, I would like to ask a last final question to all of you, to all of the speakers. And with that, we will probably conclude our today's conversation. The question is, some would call it $1 million question, which is like for me is to be honest, when I first read the declaration, one sentence was very I would say not alarming, but I paid particular attention to that, and not only me. That was the sentence about a stronger Europe in a stronger NATO, and there was a great emphasis more on European efforts and efforts by Canada, and kind of separation, like Europe, Canada, United States. So, in your opinion, this question goes to all of you. Like, what does it mean for the future of European security architecture and the US role within it? So, who will go first? Okay, let's start with Ambassador Herbst then, because he's from the other side of Atlantic, so that will be appropriate.
I think you should look at this ambiguously.
Mhm.
That statement could be a uh, perfectly fine contribution to strengthening a NATO where the United States leadership role and commitment remains strong. Uh, because the increased European ability to produce weapons to defend itself makes NATO stronger. And it deals with the political problem which is real regarding the perception in the United States that the US has overspent compared to its allies on the alliance. On the other hand, we know that there are, let's say, not geopolitically nuanced thinkers in the administration who think that a weaker NATO is not in any way bad for American interest. That's disastrous, foolish thinking. And this could be interpreted as language which bolsters their aims to reduce the American participation in NATO, which goes far beyond simply increased expenditures on defense by our European allies and beyond. Well, that's I think that's probably enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Giuseppe, maybe you want to
Yeah.
work on this?
Oh, sure. I can try. I know the person who came up with that sentence actually, but I will
Oh,
not
really?
reveal their name. But yeah, so it's there's some people who do the thinking there. I think it's a good slogan there that basically encompasses what they want to do within the alliance. The idea is that you strengthen European capabilities, but at the same time, you do that within the framework of NATO. So keep the NATO centrality, the NATO focality. That's from their perspective. That's from the viewpoint of the Secretary General. That's the point. I think this is something that most Europeans want to get on board with. I think Europeans are the ones who cheer NATO the most, who want NATO to survive, and would prefer NATO in any case. They would want a NATO with less America. They would I think they would prefer NATO without America to no NATO at all because of the structures of the integrated military command and so on. So I think that's how this is designed now. And I think that there's no actor in Europe, no European country that wants to do this without necessarily going against NATO. Okay, so there's of course there are some countries within Europe that are not in NATO, and there's tensions. You know the Cyprus-Turkey case in which there are, or even with Greece, there are certain countries within NATO or with NATO and the EU that have clearly some security issues with each other. But other than that, there's mostly an emphasis, and I think that from the EU side too, an emphasis that NATO will remain the focal organization for all this. And the point is to make it realistic, to make it in a way that ensures that there is a transition with a European-led NATO, but with the structure of the alliance that maintains a deterrence element vis-a-vis Russia. That's the key point. So that's how I understand it.
Perfect. You? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give my 2 cents, as they say, across the Atlantic. I mean, obviously that statement and the one in The Hague, they're essentially they're Trump handling statements. I mean, they don't want to get into too much detail. It's about the whole summit these whole summits now are run around, making them short, making them snappy, getting him in and out, and trying to avoid major catastrophe. So that's part of what's going on. But of course, behind that, there is this much bigger issue, which is the transatlantic relationship is changing, that there's a structural transformation underway, and US interests in Europe are not what they were, and they won't go back to that, even under the next administration. So you can sort of speculate, if we'd had a Kamala Harris presidency, how would that statement look from that summit? It wouldn't be that short, but I mean, I think we would be also sort of wondering a bit about where the US is going on Europe. And so, and I would say, of course, the US is not leaving Europe. I mean, Europe will remain a core US security interest. It has interests there, including in the High North, as I said, but it doesn't want to, underpin the expansionist kind of European agenda of a wider Europe. It's not going to backstop that as it did for 20, 30 years by offering NATO security guarantees to EU members. It's less interested in some parts of Europe than others. So this is all, I think, hidden behind that statement is that there is that change going on. Now, to me, the worrying thing is that I think we've got a lot of focus in Europe on capabilities, on sort of keeping the US in, but there is no European leadership in NATO. NATO is a US organization, and that statement also shows that there is no strategic direction in NATO. There was none in the Hague Summit statement, and there's none here. It's just about getting to 5% and sort of fulfilling the commitments. There's no vision of the future. There's no big commitments, and so this is, I think, and Ivo Dulda had a commentary in Politico, I think, reinforcing that this was a missed opportunity. He says for Europe to kind of assert leadership. But the problem is that there is no European leadership because we don't know who would lead. And this is what America's pullback is exposing, is that we have, every day now there's articles about France's concern about how much money Germany is spending, and it's spending it on German rearmament. And Germany is building a kind of its own new European security architecture, often around the Baltic. So this, I think, is going to be the challenge for Europe, is that NATO only works if the US remains in. I mean, certainly the Europeans can take on capabilities, but if the US doesn't lead NATO and there isn't a strategic vision behind it, it's not a framework that's going to be the one that will actually allow us probably to respond to the Russians. I mean, that'll take place elsewhere. And then we're going to look at much more of these minilateral E3, E5, sub-regional organizations. So I think that is what you also see around the NATO summit, as I was highlighting. I think a lot of the stuff that's happening is actually taking place in NATO, but is through those formats. NATO is kind of the cover for hedging with your neighbors increasingly in Europe.
Great, thank you. Irina, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Maggie. No, I guess Neil, Mr. Habs, and Giuseppe excellently framed everything, so I don't have anything to add. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the speakers for joining us.
Well, great. Then it's time to conclude, I think, our discussion today. Thank you, all of you who decided to join us, accepting our invitation. It's a great honor and pleasure, honestly. I mean, I'm so grateful to all of you. Thank you for participants who joined us today. Well, I think our discussion, I would say, gives us opportunity to conclude that the next phase of NATO's adaptation will depend on two main objectives, like one, making their armed forces stronger, and another, making their societal resilience really strong. So I think this is really important, and the time will show. So thank you all. Thank you SSI team, especially Irina Mamulashvili, Tina Tingashishaladze, the head of Transatlantic Area Program, Associate Director of SSI, Mariam Gamdlishvili, and we'll look forward to continue this type of discussions, follow Strategic Security Initiative, and stay with us. Thank you again, and have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right. Thank you very much.